Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for coming. I live in New York, but I consider myself a Chicagoan. My parents met at the University of Chicago, physics lab partners, and then I went to University of Chicago, and when I told that to my physics lab partner, he was really scared. We did not get married, but Chicago's a big part of my life, and it's great to be here. So I'm going to tell you a story about privacy and surveillance, and I'm going to tell it to you through my own story of how I came to this issue, why I think it's important, because I think it's the best way to really relate to a very abstract and somewhat confusing topic. So I'm just going to start with who I am. This is me. I grew up in California. My parents, after the University of Chicago, went and really wanted to join what was then the computer revolution, right? So back when computers went from the size of this room to the size of this podium, it was very exciting. And so they went and became software engineers. And I grew up really just a computer native, even though it was the 80s. So this was my first computer. I'd never had a typewriter. So although the young generation now likes to call themselves a digital native, I still feel like I should get some sort of mantle of digital native as well. And Steve Jobs lived in my town. I was in Palo Alto, and so he was doing a thing where he wanted to teach kids to code. So in my elementary school, I learned to program in 5th grade. And so I've always been a technologist, and I've always loved technology. And I was going to go into the technology business, but I took a wrong turn somewhere, and I ended up as a journalist. I fell in love with journalism actually as editor-in-chief of the Chicago Maroon at the University of Chicago. And so I ended up working at the Wall Street Journal. I joined in 2000, and at that time, it was the dot-com boom. Everyone was super excited about the arrival of the internet. And so they thought that they were mistaken, but they thought that I knew a lot about computers. I really hadn't done any programming since, I think, 5th grade when I learned it, but it was enough to make me seem tech literate. And as I was covering the technology industry, I got really interested in something that I thought was going to be the future. And I was sort of right. I went and wrote this book about MySpace. So I thought social networking was going to be this future awesome thing. And I was right, but I picked the wrong social network to write about. MySpace, as you probably all know, did not succeed, and Facebook became the winner of that battle over the dominant social network. And so the thing is, though, that while I was researching that book, I came across what I thought was a really interesting idea, which was the idea that these companies were just making money off your data, right? The social networks don't charge you to use their service. And I grew up in a world where you paid for software. So I would go, when I was growing up, to stores like this, and I would buy software. It was sold in a box, shrink wrapped. It was about $60, if I remember. And you got a CD, you put it in your computer. It was a totally different business model. And so as a reporter who covered business at the Wall Street Journal, I thought this is a really interesting new business model. It's sort of like they're selling your privacy. And I think we've all come to realize that that is the truth, right? This is the mantra that you probably have all heard before, which is if you're not the customer, right? That's being sold. And that's the realization we've all come to, is that these technologies are selling our data in some way. So after I came back from the stunning success of my MySpace book tour, that's a joke, I came back to the Wall Street Journal, and I was like, let's do some stories about this new business model, and what does it mean? What are they selling about us? So in 2010, I launched this series at the Wall Street Journal called What They Know. And really, the very simple idea I had was, what do they know? What do they know about me? What are they doing with it? And our very first story was the idea of cookies. So cookies are, as you probably all know, just little text files that are installed on your computer that allow companies to track your movements as you go surfing the web. And they build a profile of your interests based on the websites that you visit. So we found a woman named Ashley, who let us sort of look at her cookie, and the company that had installed that cookie told us what they knew about her, I think to their never-ending regret. But they knew she was 26, she lived in Tennessee, that her favorite movies, her favorite quizzes, and this was just from following her around and watching her movements. And the thing that was shocking about our story, our first story, was actually not so much about the cookies, because people knew that, but the fact, the scale of it, right? So we measured how much tracking was happening across the internet. This is our representation of how many tracking technologies were installed on your computer just by visiting 10 pages of the dictionary.com site, and it was 234 trackers. So the scale of the tracking that we measured across the internet was really vast. And it led my editors to say, you know what, let's do more stories like this. This is really surprising. So the next thing we did was looked at your apps to see which cell phone apps were sending data back to third parties that you didn't know about. So Pandora, this is a visual representation of the data Pandora sends out. It's one of the sort of leakiest apps in the sense that it sends a lot of information about you to third parties. And there's no way for you to tell, right? The way I was able to do this was had 2 computer scientists set up a mobile lab and test phones for 2 months. So this is not something that a normal person can figure out. There's no way for you to know what your apps are sending back about you. Then we found some bad behavior by some of the leading companies. So this is a story we did about Google. They were installing a secret code inside the ads that were displaying across the web, and that code would trick your web browser into turning off the privacy settings that you had. So if you were blocking the installation of their cookie, it would figure out a way to trick them into taking it. So after we exposed this, the Federal Trade Commission fined them $22.5 million, which was, I think, the largest privacy fine and maybe remains so to this day. But it's worth noting that that's 5.5 hours worth of Google's revenue. So I don't know that they've been running scared since then. So, another thing we did was we looked into what happens once this data is out there about you. How does your web experience change? So Capital One is a credit card company, and when you go to their website, they actually make an instant assessment of your income, education level, and the city you're in order to display the card that they think you would want. So I don't know if you can read the green code up there, but in it, that's the computer code that's sent between your computer and the website, and it actually says for this guy, downscale is what they called him, some college, and they gave him kind of a middling card. Now, you can still go to another part of the website and find another credit card to apply for, but this is the kind of thing that is not transparent to you as a user of the internet, but that you are being sort of judged and scored based on all this technology that you can't see. And it's happening in all sorts of ways. So this is a story we did about a car dealership. You would send an email to them to set up a test drive, and actually they did some kind of crazy technological tricks to figure out what websites you had previously visited to look at which cars. So that by the time you arrived at the lot, they already knew what you had seen, what cars, what prices, right? And you can see how this might limit your negotiation ability during a car buying experience. And then, Staples is another example. So Staples, we found, was charging different prices in different zip codes. So a stapler might cost $14 in one zip code and $15 in another. And this was true across the nation. And we drew these maps. This is a map of Iowa, and you can see the white is the places where we're getting the cheaper prices, and green was getting higher prices. And we couldn't quite figure out, it took us a long time to figure out what was the logic. Why were these weird pockets of places, some people getting better prices? And we actually finally figured out that it was distance from a competitor's store. So if you lived near an Office Max or an Office Depot, they would give you a cheaper price. And that makes perfect sense, right? I'm from the University of Chicago. The economists there would love this pricing strategy. But the truth is that We also looked at the demographics of those people, and the people who live near Office Max and Office Depots are also people who are whiter and more high income. And so essentially, those people were getting discounted prices, and lower income minority people were getting higher prices. So this is a kind of inadvertent discrimination that can come from this kind of algorithmic decision making that is invisible to all of us. And I think this still is true to this day, that you will get different prices. You should check with your friends on the price of a stapler on Staples. It's not illegal, right? It's perfectly fine to charge different prices, it turns out. So after I was doing these stories, at first I thought it would be a couple stories, then it turned out to be a year, and then it was 2 years. About a year in, people started saying to me, you know what, Julia, you're really focused on all this like commercial stuff, but there's someone else out there tracking you, the government. And so I turned my attention to some government surveillance. And the way I was looking at it was also sort of as a business reporter, which was that the cost of surveillance technology has gone down so much, right? So what was possible just only for the NSA 20 years ago is now off-the-shelf software that Ethiopia can buy for $10,000 or $5,000. So we snuck into, well, we didn't sneak in, we obtained documents from a secret conference where countries around the world go to buy this kind of software, spyware, hacking tools, ways to basically monitor the citizens of their countries. And it's pretty cheap, right? The things that they can get are really powerful and actually affordable, even for a country as poor as Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, I'm using them as an example because they have used these tools pretty aggressively against journalists and jailed them for writing, dissident things. And that's not unusual. I'm sure you guys have heard of, there are a lot of countries out there who are now using these tools in repressive ways. And it's not just third world countries that are using these tools, it's also your local police. So this is a picture of a guy in California who his local police department installed automatic license plate recognition technology, which is basically on every police car, they put cameras on the hood and in the back. And as the police are driving around doing their normal activities, these cameras are just designed to take pictures of every license plate they see. They scan the environment, see if there's something that looks like a license plate, and take a picture. And so he filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get all the times that his license plate had been photographed by his local police department. And what he got was 200 pictures, including this one of him and his daughters getting out of their car in their driveway over a 2-year period, right? So that is a photo every few days of him and his location. And this is a real change in the relationship between the citizen and their police department, because previously he has not a criminal record, and so he had not got any files at the local police department. Of course, they had the ability to find out who he was, but they didn't have a file on him. And that's changed, right? Now police departments have files on everyone. Almost every police department around has these automatic license plate readers. And here in Chicago, I went to visit a private company. They are repo men, and they have actually realized that a great way to supplement their repo business is to also scan license plates and sell them to the police. So just in case your police aren't doing it, there's like a beautiful private industry that will do it for you as well. And they're just right north of here. You want to go visit them. After doing this for 3 years, I really thought, wow, this is a really depressing thing that I've come across. And I was wondering, could it be any worse? Well, then, of course, obviously, what happened next? Edward Snowden, right? And so this was this amazing moment where I thought I was at the far end of the paranoia spectrum, and I couldn't be any more paranoid. And then this guy shows up, and he's like, no, they're doing even more than you thought, right? I did not think that our government was collecting every single phone call record of every American made domestically. I didn't. I thought that seemed kind of unconstitutional. And there had been rumors that they were doing something really aggressive with phone calls, and I had been trying to file Freedom of Information Act requests and trying to talk to senators about who were on the committees to try to find out what it was. No one would tell me, and when that first story came out showing that they were collecting every phone call, I was blown away. I had never thought it was that vast. So that really made me think, well, what is the right level of paranoia? And now that I realize that you can never be too paranoid, what do I do with that information? So that took me to East Germany. I mean, the former East Germany. So I thought, we have seen this movie before, but on a sort of analog version, right? The Stasi, the secret police of East Germany, were famously comprehensive in their surveillance. They had files on 1 out of 5 citizens, and they employed, I think, 1 out of 8 as an informant. So they were extremely busy. And what's great about the Stasi, if anything, is that we have all their files. Because after the regime collapsed, the German people prevented them from burning and shredding them. And so we can go and see the archives. You can't actually really go and see everything. The way the law is that you can see a file about yourself. So you can file a Freedom of Information Act to see whether you were surveilled, and then you get to read the file. But as a member of the media, I was able to get a few files and that people had agreed to be released. And so I filed a Freedom of Information Act request in Germany. It was a little confusing because they would only communicate with me in German and I would respond in English, and somehow that worked out. But what happened was I got this. I got a bunch of files, which are up on my website, but this one is really revelatory to me. So I asked them, is there anything like a social network? Did they draw social networks to see who was friends with who? And so this was a social network that they drew for a dissident poet. It has 46 little squares on it. Some of them are people, some of them are locations that he went to. And it took them years to sort of map out, and they weren't totally sure, right? He would go to a location and then a person lived there, and I thought maybe that's related, but not sure, right? And so I thought, this is pretty crude. And they had teams of, their main tools were physical surveillance, so they'd have teams of 2 that would follow you. They could steam open your mail, and they could listen to your calls. And all of this was very labor intensive. So I thought, well, what does my social network look like? What would be the comparison? So I used a tool that these people at MIT have developed, which you have to trust them, and I hope they're trustworthy, because I gave them access to my Gmail inbox, and they will visualize it for you. And so this is what they showed me, which is that this is what my network looks like. There's a couple people I talk to all the time, and then there's a lot of people I talk to much less frequently. It was a little disturbing because my husband is a very small dot. And I was worried that he was going to be mad if he saw this chart. The bigger dots are my girlfriends, it turns out. So, and no one had to do any work, right? No teams had to follow me. Nobody had to, steam open my mail. This is just the metadata, actually, of my Gmail inbox. And so the government can get this under a very low standard. They can go to Google with a secret court order and say, give me Julia's metadata, and Google will say, okay, metadata, it's no big deal. Here you go, right? And so it was just illustrative to see what is available to a government now without any work, without any level of suspicion, right? They don't have to have a certain level of suspicion about me. So what does it mean? I think we've all kind of realized this in some way in the post-Snowden era. What happens to you when you know that all this information is available about you? I was looking into studies, and there aren't that many studies about the impact of surveillance, but there is one in the Helsinki privacy experiment. These researchers asked 10 families to install total surveillance in their home. They had cameras, microphones, all their computer usage was monitored, their shopping, loyalty cards, their purchases were monitored, and 10 families agreed to do this. And what was interesting about it is the way they reacted to the surveillance. So one family, I think, dropped out after 3 months, couldn't handle it. Everyone found that it was really stressful in the beginning, and then they learned to habituate. They started to have private conversations outside the home or in the bathroom, which was the room that wasn't monitored. And so they learned to adjust to it, and their level of anxiety decreased. But then it would increase when unexpected events happened. A friend would come over and didn't realize that the home was being surveilled and start talking about something sensitive. And then they would freak out, like, oh my God, we have to go to the cafe, or we can't do this here. And I feel like, to me, this rings true. In the post-Snowden era, do you feel like this is what happened to you? You're generally some spike in anxiety, But then you're like, okay, I just won't write anything important in my email. Well, that's fine, no problem, right? But then someone writes you an email with some provocative thing, and you're like, oh, I don't know what to respond. Or this is definitely how I have behaved, right? I'm starting to put less and less out there, and then I get anxious when people try to provoke me into exposing more in ways that I think were going to be used against me later. So given the situation of what happens to you under surveillance, I thought, okay, well, I'm an investigative journalist. I like to investigate things. Let's figure out, is there any hope? Is privacy dead, or do we have any hope? And that's really the premise of my book, which came out last year, Dragnet Nation, is I attempted to get myself out of as much of the dragnet as possible, right? I'm not looking to get out of I'm not looking to escape the law if I'm a criminal, but I don't want to be surveilled if it feels unfair, that I didn't do anything to deserve it. So I did a whole bunch of steps to see, could I protect myself? So the first thing I did was I tried to break up with Google. I felt like, you can decide whether they're evil or not, but they certainly had more information about me than anybody, and so easily accessible, and ultimately, it's going to be the first stop for the government to go get information about me. So I switched from Google search to this search called DuckDuckGo. It's a search engine that basically doesn't know anything about you and doesn't, when you're typing into Google, it fills in the sentence for you as you're typing. So in DuckDuckGo, at first, I felt so like, oh, this is so much work, I have to actually finish writing the word. And then I realized that is so crazy that I've gotten myself trained to think that the machine actually knows better than I do what I want to type. And it's never more than 3 words you're really searching for. So I've been using them successfully for a couple years, and I find everything I need, although my colleagues come over to my desk and laugh while I'm searching. It makes them happy for some reason. I use this thing called Disconnect, which is something you add to your web browser. It's an add-on, and it blocks all the ad tracking. So all the little trackers that are the cookies that are being installed by third parties to follow you around the web, and those are the ones that enable those ads that follow you around after you look for a product. So I don't get followed around by those ads, and it's actually a pretty easy technology to use. Quitting Gmail was hard, though, because there's not a privacy-protecting email service that's easy to find. Gmail itself doesn't offer you the opportunity to pay and get out of tracking. You can pay, but you don't get out of being tracked. And there seems to be not really a robust market for this. So all I could find was this service, RiseUp, that I use. RiseUp is a lovely service. It is run by an anarchist collective in Seattle. And to join RiseUp, you must sign their manifesto. And so the manifesto is you must be opposed to capitalist oppression, gender oppression, class oppression, and a couple other kinds of oppression. At the time, it's worth noting, I was working at the Wall Street Journal, whose tagline was "Adventures in Capitalism," right? And so it required a bit of mental gymnastics for me to sign this manifesto, but I did realize that I'm against oppression, capitalist or not, so it's okay, so I signed it. But I can understand that it's not for everyone. And so there aren't a lot of options for me to offer you all in terms of privacy protecting email, although I will say it works surprisingly fast and actually better than Gmail. I left Google Docs and I got an encrypted cloud service called SpiderOak so that my documents are encrypted before they go into the SpiderOak repository, and that way they can't read them. I am the only one who can unlock them. And then, for situations where I wanted my web browsing to be even more protected than using DuckDuckGo, I use Tor, which is a web browser that bounces your traffic around the world so that it looks like you might be coming from Amsterdam instead of where you are sitting in Chicago. And that's actually a very easy-to-use web browser that has a lot of privacy controls built in, and if you want to try it, I would recommend it. So then I had to deal with social networking, which of course I had declared to be the future. So I realized I just had to leave Facebook. There wasn't a great way for me to control my privacy. First of all, anyone who's tried to use the privacy settings on Facebook will agree with me, I'm sure, that they're constantly changing. It's impossible to keep on top of all the different changes. And for me as a journalist, the idea that my friends list is somehow publicly available is also just not a great idea. Whether or not somebody is actually a source of mine, a secret source, it doesn't matter, but if they're on my friends list, they're automatically a suspect of that. And that doesn't help me as a journalist to have that kind of list available to the public. And there's no way to make that completely locked down on Facebook's service. For the same reason, I quit LinkedIn. And I was worried that I would never get a job again. I never used LinkedIn, but I think that actually this is a very common feeling, which is I had this feeling like, I might need it, right? We have this sort of loss aversion about our data, which is that we want to hoard it. We're not sure what we need it for, but we feel stressed about getting rid of it. And I honestly think that's what the NSA is feeling too, and then that's what's driving the over-collection. It's just this idea, well, if you can get it, maybe you should just hoard it. But after quitting LinkedIn, I left the Wall Street Journal for a dream job at ProPublica, where it's a nonprofit investigative reporting fund, and I realized that actually LinkedIn was not preventing me from getting jobs, so that was helpful. Then I get to some really challenging things. So data brokers are companies you've never heard of who collect information about you that's publicly available. So they'll go and get your property records, your voting records, your magazine subscriptions, as much as they can find, car ownership, put it in a big file, and sell it to marketers, they sell it to the government, they sell it to law enforcement. And you've never heard of any of them. Axiom, Experian you might have heard of because they just got breached, which is really helpful to think about all that data getting breached. And they don't have any obligation to give you an opt-out or to let you see your data. So you can't see it and you can't get rid of it. And we're actually one of the only Western nations that doesn't require that about commercial data gatherers. So in Europe and Canada, there are laws that say if you have that kind of information, you need to show it to people, and in some cases you have to be able to give them the opportunity to have it removed. But we don't have that, so I was able to locate through digging about 212 different data sellers, and of those, only 92 offered opt-outs. So it turns out that by opting out of all of those, I actually ended up just keeping my data in the ones with the bad actors, right? Giving them more valuable data because it was more scarce. So I feel like that was an unsuccessful privacy move. And then, of course, the most difficult thing was my phone, because our phones are like fetish items, right? We carry them with us everywhere. We put them next to our bed when we're sleeping. We bring them into the bathroom. They are with us all the time, and you can't tell what they're doing. They're communicating with a cell phone tower, they're communicating with like Wi-Fi, they're communicating with Bluetooth, and you can't see what they're sending, right? Every once in a while, someone like me sets up a mobile lab and shows you what the apps are getting, but otherwise, you don't have an idea of minute by minute what is being sent. And so I thought, well, I am clever. I'll come up with a different identity so that they'll be just tracking a different person. So my alternate identity is Ida Tarbell. Ida was a muckraking journalist at the turn of the century. She wrote a series of groundbreaking articles about Standard Oil and its abuse of its monopoly. And those led to the breakup of Standard Oil and the strengthening of antitrust laws. And so she's a journalist heroine of mine for a long time, and I thought she wouldn't mind me using her name. I don't have a way to verify that. But so I set up Ida as an entity. I got her an address. A friend let me get mail for her. I actually got her a credit card, which was surprising to me that I was able to do, but basically I just added her as like a kid to my account. So I pay her bills. So American Express knows it's me, but that gives me the ability to walk into a store with a card that says Ida. And so using that card, I was then able to get her a phone. And so I got her an Android phone because I felt a little guilty about breaking up with Google. And so, and I was really proud of myself, and I walked around and I made lots of calls, and all my friends were really annoyed that I had some new number, and my husband kept forgetting it. And eventually I realized this is ridiculous. I'm going to all the same places and making all the same calls. I mean, Ida and I are indistinguishable, it turns out, and so I'm not really fooling anyone. So I realized that this strategy wasn't that helpful. So I ended up in a very sad situation, which is that the only way to really block tracking in my cell phone is stick it in a bag. This is what's known as a Faraday cage. It's a bag, a cloth bag that's lined with a thin amount of metal, and that prevents any signals, cell phone, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, from going through. I mean, it's sort of like not having a phone. But I use it when I'm going to meet a source or somewhere I just don't want to be tracked. I slip the phone in there. But this is really an example of a failure, right? There should be a better way to protect your privacy with your phone than sticking it in a metal bag. So at the end of my journey, I felt like, okay, that was kind of a mixed bag, but boy, was it expensive. So I added up everything I spent. It was almost $2,500 in 1 year. And that is just too much money to spend on privacy, right? And it raises the question of whether privacy is becoming a luxury good. It's something that only the rich can afford. And I thought about that and wrote this op-ed about it, but then I realized actually it's worse than that. It's like a fake luxury good. It's like the fake Prada bag that you buy on Canal Street, because I didn't get privacy, right? I could not get out of the data brokers. I could not protect my cell phone. I couldn't get anyone to use encrypted emails with me, which I didn't even discuss because I couldn't get anyone to do it. And more than that, I didn't have any assurance that my tools worked, right? I think the DuckDuckGo guys are really nice. I went down to their offices in Philadelphia and I looked them in the eye and they seemed really nice and trustworthy and that they're not taking my data, but what do I know, right? I have no way to measure whether any of this stuff that I was doing made any difference. And so in the end, I realized, I'm not actually looking for privacy. I'm actually looking for assurances of how my data will be treated, right? I want what I get when I buy a car. When I buy a car, I know, first of all, it has a baseline safety standards they have to meet. And if they don't meet them, then I get to sue them, and then the NHTSA gets to sue them, and then they have to go to Congress, and they have to cry and say they're really sorry, and then they have to recall the cars and send out new cars. All of that process I wanted for my data. And then I realized we do have a name for that, right? It's called justice. We actually have a name for what we want out of our data. We want human rights, we want due process, we want justice. And so that's why I realized, and that's why my talk, I don't know if you saw, is labeled the issue formerly known as privacy. Because I don't think privacy is what we're seeking. I think privacy is a word we use to describe the fact that we don't have any rights over our data, and our data is used to define us. And so I don't know how many of you remember when Prince decided to change his name to the artist formerly known as Prince, but I borrowed his symbol and made it a privacy symbol with an I, and I call it the issue, formerly known as privacy. And so what I would ask of you, maybe, if you agree with anything that I've said, is when your friends talk about privacy and they say it's dead and you shouldn't care about it, that you say to them, maybe it's not a privacy issue, but it's a rights issue. What rights do we have over our data in this world where everything is defined by data? So that's it. I don't take questions.
Yesterday, I was listening to the news in the car, and there was a report about body cameras for police. They said to make it more palatable, they're going to put face recognition on all of the cameras that the police are walking around. So your face will come up, and they will be able to ascertain whether you are a person of interest. I found that rather alarming. My question is, if we can do everything that you were talking about, why is it that we are not tracking who comes into our country and who leaves?
Who comes into our country? We are tracking who comes into our country and who leaves that I know of. So we've been fighting with the European Union for almost a decade, since 9/11, about the fact that we wanted lists of everybody who arrived before they even got on the plane, and we have won that right. But so I guess I'm not sure that I totally think that we're not tracking that, but it is interesting, the disparities about what data is collected and what is not. I sometimes joke, and I wish this was not true, but that gun owners probably are the only people with privacy in America, right? It turns out that getting the list of gun owners is extremely hard to get, and it's protected because we have the Second Amendment. But all sorts of other data is completely available. And then we have privacy laws that are supposed to protect certain privacy, like the HIPAA law, which basically, as far as I can tell, only protects your medical records from you, right? Like you can't get them, but everybody else is just fine, right? So we have a very, what people say about the way we approach privacy in the US is it's sectoral, meaning we have like a privacy law for guns, and we have one for HIPAA, and we have one for students. But what it means actually is we don't have what other countries have, which is a baseline privacy minimum standard that everyone has to meet.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, can you explain to the general public what stingrays are and
Yes.
the dangers of
Sure.
them?
So Stingrays are a device that, it's a box like this big, that the police and other law enforcement use to simulate a cell tower. So basically when you're near it, your phone will talk to it thinking it's a cell tower. And that means that they know which phones are nearby. So the police have vans that they drive around with Stingrays to see who's at a political protest. There have been stories about that. They do it to find a criminal that they're looking for. They might go to an area that they think he's at, and they sweep up a vast amount of cell phone data. One of the more disturbing stories was about, I think it was the US Marshals who were flying low-flying planes with Stingrays in them and trying to just capture all the cell phones below. And right now, they're not at all regulated. So what's happening is, in many cases, the FBI's stated policy is not to alert the judge or ask a judge for permission to use the Stingray. And so the judges don't know. They sign a search warrant for some other thing, thinking that's like a regular search, and then actually Stingrays are being used. There's a lot of battles going on in court right now about the Stingray.
A lot of my friends have much stronger, friends from Europe have much stronger concerns about privacy than we do. So what do they know that we don't? There's
a lot of theories about why Europeans care more about privacy. So I don't know what the reason is, but the way that they approach it is as a human right. So it's actually part of their idea of a human right that you should be given without having to argue for it. Whereas here, the way we look at it is actually, it's sort of very American, which is like, unless you can prove harm and bring a class action suit about how you were, a malpractice kind of suit, you can't, it's not a right you should have. And so we just have a very different view. And the problem with proving harm is that you don't really know when your data is used against you, right? So you might not get a good deal on that car dealership that I showed earlier, but you wouldn't know unless I had done that story. You wouldn't actually know why you had gotten the bad price. Or none of you had ever known that you got a different price for a stapler on staples.com. So it's very difficult to prove harm in court, and so, but that's the way we've chosen to approach it in this country.
A related question, you mentioned the European law that we don't have an analog for here in the United States, and you also, by redefining the issue as a rights issue, sort of naturally segues into a legislative issue. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could comment on efforts or lack of efforts or barriers to having that type of privacy legislation here in the United States.
Yes, absolutely. So actually, to its credit, the Obama administration has introduced, I think in the past 3 sessions of Congress, a bill called the Privacy Bill of Rights, and it really is an attempt to match the European baseline privacy standards, although it is much weaker, okay? And even that weak bill has failed to move, has no support. The privacy community believes it's too weak, which it definitely is, barely anything. And the data industry, which really is our booming technology industry, has no interest in such a bill passing. And so what's interesting to me is that we were able, post-Snowden, to pass a bill reining in the NSA, but there's absolutely no prospect of reining in commercial data gathering. And I think that's because that's our best industry right now. This is, no politician wants to do anything that would stop the momentum of our tech industry. Now, I would argue that a baseline playing field didn't kill the car industry and isn't going to kill the technology industry if there were certain standards everyone has to comply with. But apparently my view is not widely shared.
Last week I just happened to be Googling my brother's name in Illinois, looking for there's a list where you can see if they owe you money, the state of Illinois owes you money, and several years ago they did, and I told my brother about it. Well, he and my sister-in-law live in Florida, and they have for years, and so for grins, when I just Googled his name, it came up, and I got his voter registration, his actual voter registration number. And so I thought, well, that's kind of weird. So I checked in Illinois, and in Illinois, that's not given out except to, I forget what it was, certain political organizations that can prove they're using it for political means. So when I Googled my name, I didn't get my voter registration information, but in the state of Florida, it's public, which I thought was bizarre.
Right. So what's interesting to me about the voter registration records is that to participate in our wonderful democracy, you must vote. And it's the greatest right we have as citizens. And in order to vote in every state, there are a certain amount of personal data you must reveal. It varies by state, but it's often your birth date, address, political affiliation, and can be fairly extensive or not. Most states sell that data. So there's, once again, no baseline privacy standard, so every state has its own rules about whether they sell it and to whom. And so maybe in Illinois, certain qualified buyers can get it, and maybe in Florida, anyone can get it. But I think that 33 states sell it. And so it's one of those things that is sort of, I call it in my book, the dark data cycle, because to register to vote, you give this information. Then they actually sell it to a data broker. The data broker takes your voter files, matches it with your property records, and actually they sell it back to the candidates, right? The politicians are the biggest buyers of this to then target you for the next voting cycle, and then they sell it to law enforcement in order to track you for various, possible crimes. So it's really, the government is like making you do it, and then they're actually buying it back. They actually pay for it twice, which is also just government waste.
If my cell phone is turned off, can it still be tracked?
Depends on how much they want to track you. So if there was a talk by the CIA chief technology officer 2 years ago, and he confirmed what a lot of people had long suspected, that if your phone is off, he said, we can still track you. What they have the ability, if they've installed remotely some sort of spyware on your phone, they could activate it when you've turned it off, or they could also just enable the microphone to record. So people who are very paranoid like me have to stick them in this silly bag to make sure that that's not happening.
You mentioned Edward Snowden. Do you consider him a hero or a traitor, and do you think he should be allowed back in the United States without being prosecuted for treason?
I mean, I am an admirer of Edward Snowden. I was trying to get that story. I was myself trying to get that story through legal means. I had filed Freedom of Information Act requests seeking the documents about that phone metadata program. I had gone to members of Congress and asked them, would you please, I know there's a secret program, because it had been known that there was a secret program, but no one knew what it was. Asked them, would you please read it on the floor of the House? You're immune from prosecution at that time. No one was willing to do it. No one had the political courage to stand up and reveal that program. 2 courts have since ruled that that was unconstitutional, and the government shut it down before it went to the Supreme Court. There was a circuit split on that. But the fact is, he revealed something that, once it was in public, was actually considered possibly unconstitutional, and the government shut it down. I think that's a public service. But I'm a journalist, right? My job is to get people to tell me things, to reveal things that the government doesn't want us to do. I understand that other people think that he had to feel, he had to abide by his oath to protect the classified documents that he had, and that's also a legitimate issue. But he was in a situation where that program was legal but illegal, in the sense that it had been approved by the secret court and by the secret committee in Congress. And so it was legal, like in the rubber stamp way, but it turns out it might not have been legal in the constitutional way. I don't know how other way you get that story out than telling the press.
Several smartphone companies are planning to offer enhanced encryption, but apparently the federal government is taking the position that only if there's a backdoor for them to decrypt this, it would be useful. Does that make it a moot point, that there's no sense in having it?
Oh, no, there's definitely important to have encryption, and the government has kind of backed off of their requests. Basically, the government would really like to have a backdoor so that they could unlock any encrypted content out there. And you can imagine, and when I say the government, it's really the FBI that's been pushing for that. But actually, the White House put out a paper, or actually leaked out a paper, which of course, when they leak out classified information, it's totally not traitorous. But that paper showed that the White House policy had actually, they have decided to back off that issue and not ask for the backdoor. That's not to say that fight won't continue. It will continue forever. The problem with backdoors, and I'll explain it just a little bit, is that what it means is essentially that you're giving somebody, a master key to your lock. The problem is not so much that master key. If you could assure yourself that the FBI would only use it in certain cases and they would put it in some locked box, it would never be used any other time, and a judge would approve it. Maybe in some theoretical world that would be true. But is that the world we live in? The world where the CIA director is getting hacked, the world where all of the background briefing checks on every government employee at OMB was hacked? There's no way you can keep that key safe. That's really the reason the backdoor is bad, because China's going to own that backdoor in 3 seconds, right? So is Russia, because hacking is the way of the world, and we're all really good at it. So once you build that, you basically are allowing a lot of intruders into your house.
How do you see drones adding to this problem?
Drones are really an interesting issue. They're one of the few privacy issues that has so much resonance that actually more than 30 states have passed drone privacy laws, which is interesting, right? So no other privacy issue has actually gotten really any attention other than the one NSA reform we've seen in the past decade. But drones seem so personally invasive, right? The idea that it would fly over your backyard and take pictures of you while you're sunning yourself or whatever. And so we do have a bunch of states that have said you can only use them with a search warrant, but that law enforcement can only use them when they get a search warrant. But the problem with drones is that it's not just law enforcement, right? My husband is like, I don't care about the cops. What I'm worried about is my neighbor flying a drone into my backyard, right? And this is the thing is like, the cost of this technology is dropping, right? So I'm talking about your local police having surveillance technology. Your neighbors are going to have surveillance technology, and that's sort of unstoppable. And so then you get into this weird situation where you're like, I'm worried about a world where we're all surveilling ourselves, each other, all the time in some sort of weird pre-litigation defensiveness. It just doesn't seem like a good way to live.
This will be the last question.
How safe are my income tax reports when I just zip them off to Kansas City or Springfield?
Actually, I don't think we've seen the IRS hacked yet, so that's good news. But I feel like that's only just a matter of time, unfortunately. The state of encryption and transmitting data across the internet is still, unfortunately, pretty weak. So thank you very much.